There's a specific kind of silence that happens when 200 people in a room realize all at once that they've been lied to. I know that silence intimately now because I'm the one who caused it. Picture a hotel ballroom, chandeliers, a stage with my name on a step and repeat banner behind it. Maya Reyes, founder and CEO. 300 people in cocktail attire, industry press in the back with cameras, a glass of champagne sweating in my hand because my palms wouldn't stop shaking. And 12 feet from the stage, at a table he had absolutely no business being invited to, sat the man who spent 2 years telling every person we both knew that I was unstable, unhinged, not well. The man who made sure that by the time I finally worked up the nerve to tell people what he'd actually done to me, nobody believed a word of it. He was smiling when I walked up to that microphone, comfortable, like he still had power over how this story would end. He had no idea what I'd been building for 3 years. He had no idea I'd kept every text message. He had no idea that the woman he tried to erase was about to stand in front of everyone who ever doubted her and let 3 years of receipts speak for themselves. By the end of that night, he wasn't the one people were whispering about anymore. I was, but not the way he'd spent 2 years hoping. Stick with me, because to understand how satisfying that night actually was, you need to go back to the beginning, back when I actually believed he loved me, and back when I had absolutely no idea he was already planning how he'd explain me away. Hey, welcome in if you're new here. I tell true stories, real experiences, some mine, some shared with me by people who trusted me enough to let me tell them right. Names, locations, and identifying details are always changed to protect privacy, but the emotions, the choices, and the consequences, every bit of that is real. If you're the kind of person who lives for a slow burn, ice-cold, deeply satisfying comeback story, the kind where the villain doesn't get yelled at, he gets outgrown, hit subscribe right now, because I post a new one of these every single week, and I promise you do not want to miss what's coming after this one. I'm going to be honest with you up front. This gets so much worse before it gets good. What starts as one relationship falling apart turns into a 2-year smear campaign, a friend group cut in half, a woman who almost didn't recover, and an ending that, according to my own best friend, made her spit out her drink in a hotel bathroom. So get comfortable. This one is long, and every minute of it earns its place. Let's go back to the beginning, back when I thought I'd found my person. My name is Maya. I'm 29 now, but this story starts when I was 23, fresh out of college, working my first real job at a marketing agency in a mid-sized city I'm not going to name, for reasons that'll make sense later. I met Derek at a coworker's birthday party. He wasn't even supposed to be there. He'd tagged along with a friend of a friend, wearing a jacket that was slightly too nice for the bar we were at, laughing at something on his phone in a way that made me want to know what was so funny. He came up to me at the bar and said, "I need a second opinion. Is it weird that I already know I'm going to order the same drink as you?" It was a ridiculous line. It worked anyway. I want to tell you honestly, the first year with Derek was genuinely wonderful, and I need you to understand that because I think a lot of you watching this have had the experience of people asking, "How did you not see it?" As if red flags come with sirens attached. They don't. They come dressed as charm. Derek was magnetic. He remembered small details, my coffee order, the name of my childhood dog, the fact that I hated when people chewed with their mouths open. He introduced me to his friend group within a month, which felt like a huge deal at the time. He'd show up to my apartment with soup when I was sick, the good kind from the deli 3 neighborhoods over, not the canned kind. Everyone loved him. That's important to remember for later. Everyone loved him. My best friend Priya, who is going to matter a lot in this story, met him for the first time over brunch about 6 weeks in and afterward texted me, "Okay, I get it now. He's actually great." I want to tell you about one memory specifically because it's the one I held on to the longest, even after everything. It was our 1 year anniversary. Derek took me to this tiny restaurant that only sat about 20 people, the kind of place you needed to know somebody to get a reservation at. He'd learned, somehow, that my favorite flowers were ranunculus, not roses, not the flowers most guys default to, and there was a small bouquet of them sitting on the table when we arrived. He raised his glass and said, "I don't know how I got lucky enough to find someone who makes ordinary days feel like this." I remember thinking, this is it. This is the person. I've replayed that dinner more than I'd like to admit since everything happened, and here's the strange thing I've had to sit with. I don't think that moment was fake. I think in whatever complicated way a person can hold two different versions of themselves at once, he meant it at least a little when he said it. That's what makes this kind of story so much harder to explain to people afterward. It's not that every good memory was a performance, it's that the good memories and the manipulation existed in the same person at the same time, and I had absolutely no way of knowing which one I was going to get on any given day. Around year 2 is when the small things started, and I want to walk you through them slowly, the way I actually experienced them, because in the moment, none of them felt like anything. The first thing was how he talked about his ex-girlfriend. Whenever her name came up, which happened more than you'd think, usually through mutual friends, he had this way of saying, almost casually, "Yeah, she went through a rough patch near the end, got kind of paranoid about everything, wasn't really herself." He always said it with this tone of gentle, patient sadness, like he was being generous by not saying more. At the time, I thought, wow, he's really mature about this. He's not bitter, he's protecting her privacy. I understand now that he was laying groundwork. He was writing the first draft of a story he'd eventually tell about me. The second thing was smaller and honestly easier to miss. Derek had this habit whenever I brought up something that bothered me, even something small like him being 40 minutes late without a text, of responding not to the issue itself, but to my reaction to the issue. "You're getting really worked up over this. I feel like you're spiraling a little. This seems like a bigger reaction than the situation calls for." He never actually addressed being late. He redirected the entire conversation to whether my response was reasonable. And because he said it so calmly, so gently, I started to believe him. I started apologizing for being upset about things that, looking back, I had every right to be upset about. If you're watching this and that pattern sounds familiar to you, I want you to actually pause the video for a second and sit with that, because I promise you, I wish someone had told me to. By the middle of year 2, our friend group had started referring to certain things as one of Maya's moments, said affectionately at first, the way you tease someone about being dramatic. I laughed along with it. I didn't realize at the time where that language was coming from. It was coming from Derek, in one-on-one conversations, in group chats I wasn't part of, in the kind of casual asides that plant themselves so gently you don't notice the garden growing until it's already overtaken everything. I found out much later, and I'll get to exactly how, that Derek had a habit of pulling individual friends aside, usually after I'd left a gathering early or seemed quiet at dinner, and saying things like, "I'm a little worried about her lately. She's been really intense." Or, "I love her. I just don't always know how to help her when she gets like this." He was building a case months before I ever did anything that would need defending. I want to tell you about the specific moment that, in hindsight, was the beginning of the end, even though it looked completely unremarkable at the time. It was a Tuesday night. Derek's phone buzzed on the counter while he was in the shower, and a name popped up on the lock screen. A coworker of his named Ashley, someone he'd mentioned before, always in passing, always in that specific tone people use when they want you to know a name is safe. The message preview said, "Can't stop thinking about last night, LOL." I stood there staring at it for what felt like an hour but was probably 10 seconds. My first instinct, and I want to be honest about this because I think it's a really human instinct, was to explain it away. Maybe it's about a work happy hour. Maybe last night means something completely innocent. I didn't want it to mean what it obviously meant. When Derek came out of the shower, I asked him about it, trying to keep my voice steady. And this is the part I want you to really pay attention to, because it's the exact moment his whole strategy clicked into place, even though I didn't understand it yet. He didn't deny anything specific. He didn't explain the message. Instead, he sighed, this long, tired, almost disappointed sigh, and said, "Maya, are we really doing this again? You're reading into a text message from my coworker." "Again?" I asked. "This has never happened before." "It feels like it happens every few weeks," he said. "You see something small and you build this whole story in your head. I can't keep having the same conversation." I want you to notice what happened there because it's a technique, whether or not he ever consciously called it that. He took a single, specific, legitimate concern, a suspicious text from a woman he cheated with, as I'd later confirm, and reframed it as part of an ongoing pattern of behavior on my part, not his actions, my reactions. And because he said this happens every few weeks with such total confidence, I actually started questioning my own memory. Had this happened before? Was I overreacting? I remember lying awake that night wondering if something was actually wrong with me. That's the part that still makes my stomach turn even now. He didn't just lie about the affair, he made me doubt my own perception of reality in the process of lying about it. I let it go. I want to be honest about that because I think it's important for anyone watching this who's currently in a version of this same situation. I let it go because the alternative, believing that the person I loved was capable of both cheating and then making me feel crazy for noticing, was too heavy a thing to carry. It was easier to believe him. Over the following 4 months, I found 2 more messages. A hotel room receipt in his email, opened accidentally when I was looking for a restaurant confirmation on his laptop while helping him plan his mom's birthday dinner. A perfume that wasn't mine once, faint on a jacket he'd said he'd worn to a work conference alone. Each time, the pattern repeated exactly. Deny the specifics, redirect to my reaction, sigh with that particular tired patience, tell me I was spiraling, tell me he couldn't keep having this conversation. And each time, our friend group's understanding of me shifted a little further in. I started noticing people getting careful around me, softer voices, fewer invitations to things where I might, in Derek's retelling, make it weird. I didn't know yet that he was having private conversations I wasn't part of. I only knew that somehow, without doing anything differently, I was becoming someone people needed to manage. I want to tell you about the last good memory I have with him, because I think it matters, the same way it mattered for me to be honest about the good moments earlier in this story. It was a weekend trip to the coast, about 2 months before everything finally broke. We rented a small cabin, and one night we sat outside wrapped in the same blanket, and he said, out of nowhere, "I know I'm not always great at this stuff, but I really do love you, Maya. I hope you know that." I did know that. I believed it completely. I think now that both things were true. I think he did love me, in whatever limited, self-serving way he was capable of. And I think he was also, at the exact same time, actively cheating on me and quietly telling our mutual friends that I was the unstable one. Both things were true. That's the part nobody prepares you for. Because what happened next, I never saw coming. The actual discovery happened on a Thursday in March, 8 months before I finally left him for good. And it happened in the most mundane way possible, which somehow made it worse. I was borrowing Derek's laptop to print a boarding pass because mine was out of battery. His email was already open. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be really clear about that. Because I know how these stories usually go, and I know some of you are expecting me to say I'd been secretly investigating him for weeks. I hadn't. I was printing a boarding pass. And sitting right there, unread, was an email from a hotel loyalty program. Subject line, "Thanks for your stay, Derek. Rate your recent visit." The date on the stay was a weekend I remembered specifically because it was a weekend Derek told me he was at a mandatory work retreat, a weekend I'd spent alone ordering takeout and watching a show we usually watch together because I didn't want to start it without him. I clicked into it. I know I shouldn't have. I also don't regret it for one single second. The reservation was for 2 guests. The room was a king suite, the kind of upgrade you don't need for a solo work trip. And attached to the loyalty account, visible in a recent activity summary I genuinely didn't know hotel emails included, was a note, "Complimentary champagne delivered to room per request, anniversary." We didn't have an anniversary that weekend. I sat there on his couch, laptop on my knees, and I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as a kind of falling. Not surprise exactly, something closer to a confirmation of a fear I'd been talking myself out of for over a year. I did something in that moment that I think surprised even me. I didn't confront him immediately. Some instinct, the same instinct I'd realize later that a lot of people in these situations develop without meaning to, told me to look further before I said anything at all. I found the group chat next. Derek had left his laptop logged into a messaging app that synced across devices, something I genuinely never checked before because I'd never had a reason to distrust him enough to look. There was a conversation with a friend of his named Colton going back almost a year. I want to tell you roughly what those conversations revealed because this is the moment the entire shape of the story changed for me. Derek had, for months, been telling Colton about the Ashley situation, casually, the way you'd talk about a hobby. He talked about how he was keeping things low-key so Maya wouldn't spiral. He talked about a weekend trip, the same weekend I'd spent alone with takeout, with details that made it very clear this wasn't a one-time slip. This was ongoing, organized, comfortable. And then I found the messages that actually broke something open in me, because it wasn't just about the affair anymore. In one message, dated back almost 8 months, Derek wrote to Colton, "NGL, I'm a little worried people are going to start asking questions eventually. Got to get ahead of it. If Maya ever tries to say something, I need people already thinking she's the unstable one, not me." Colton responded, "Bro, that's cold, LOL." Derek wrote back, "It's not cold, it's smart. I've been planting stuff for months. Everyone already thinks she overreacts to everything. By the time she figures anything out, nobody's going to believe her over me anyway." I need you to sit with me in that moment, because this is where the story stopped being about infidelity and became something else entirely. It wasn't an accident that I'd started feeling crazy over the past year. It wasn't a coincidence that our friends had gotten careful around me, that one of Maya's moments had become a shorthand everyone understood. It was a strategy, a deliberate, months-long campaign to make sure that whenever the truth came out, I would be the one nobody believed. He hadn't just cheated on me, he'd spent almost a year quietly building an insurance policy against getting caught, made entirely out of my own reputation. I want to describe what that felt like, because I think it's different from the pain of a normal betrayal. A normal betrayal, as awful as it is at least honest about what it is in the moment it's discovered. This was different. This was discovering that the ground I'd been standing on for a year had been engineered, brick by brick, specifically so that when it finally gave way, everyone would assume I'd simply tripped. I didn't cry immediately, which might surprise some of you. I think I was too far past shock and into something colder. I sat there on his couch for probably 20 minutes without moving, just staring at that conversation, reading it over and over, waiting for it to somehow mean something different the fourth time. It never did. I want to talk about the why, because I know a lot of you are already asking it. Why would someone do this? Why not just end things honestly if you wanted someone else? I've had years now to think about this, and I think the answer is simpler and uglier than people want it to be. Because leaving honestly requires being the villain of your own story. And Derek, more than almost anyone I've ever met, needed to be the hero of every story he was in, even the ones where he was clearly the one at fault. If he'd simply told me the truth, I've fallen for someone else, I want out, he'd have had to sit in the discomfort of being the person who broke something good. Instead, he found a way to keep the affair, keep the relationship's stability for as long as it was convenient, and preload an explanation that would protect his image no matter how things eventually unraveled. That's not passion. That's not two people falling for each other and losing control. That's project management. That's someone treating my reputation like a resource to be allocated in advance of a problem he already knew was coming. I closed the laptop. I want to walk you through exactly what I did next because I think it matters for the rest of this story. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I went home that night. I still had my own apartment at that point. We hadn't moved in together yet, which turned out to matter enormously later. And I sat on my bathroom floor with the fan running, the way you do when you don't want anyone, even an empty apartment, to hear you fall apart. I let myself feel every bit of it that night. The anger, the grief, the specific disorienting humiliation of realizing that people I considered friends had been quietly recalibrating how much to trust me based on a narrative I didn't even know existed. And then, around 2 a.m, something shifted. I remembered the exact thought because I wrote it down in my phone's notes app that night, and I still have it. He thinks I'm going to fall apart quietly the way he's already told everyone I would. I am not going to give him that. I confronted him 3 days later, not immediately, and I'll explain the reasoning behind that gap in a moment because it matters. When I did, I told him plainly what I'd found, the hotel email, the Colton messages, all of it. Here's what happened, and I want you to really pay attention because this is the moment that confirmed everything I needed to know about the kind of person he actually was. He didn't apologize. Not really. He said, "Okay, yes, I made a mistake with Ashley. I should have told you, but you're seriously going to go through my private messages? This is exactly the kind of thing I've been trying to protect people from having to deal with." He turned my discovery of his betrayal into evidence for the exact narrative he'd already built, in real time, without even seeming to notice the audacity of it. I ended things that night, cleanly, calmly, without giving him the reaction he'd clearly been braced for. But what happened next, I never saw coming, because I assumed that once it was over, the story would end there. A breakup, time to heal, move on. I had no idea that Derek's campaign hadn't just been preparation. It was about to become the main event. Within 2 weeks of the breakup, I started noticing things. Group chats going quiet when I joined them. A friend's birthday party I found out about only because I saw photos posted afterward. A text from someone I'd known for years gently suggesting that maybe some space would be good for everyone right now. I finally asked Priya directly what was going on, and what she told me confirmed the worst version of what I'd feared. Derek had gotten ahead of the breakup entirely. Before I'd even told most of our mutual friends what happened, he'd already reached out to several of them individually with a story that went something like this. Maya's been really struggling lately. She's been paranoid and accusatory. She went through my private messages and found some old conversations taken completely out of context, and things got really intense. I think she might need some support right now. I just want everyone to be gentle with her." He didn't deny the affair outright to everyone. He was smarter than that in case anyone ever compared notes. Instead, he minimized it into an old conversation taken out of context, reframed my discovery of it as an invasive overreaction, and this is the part that still makes me furious, positioned himself as the concerned, patient ex-boyfriend worried about my well-being. He turned being caught cheating into an opportunity to look compassionate. I want to tell you about the specific moment I understood how completely this had worked, because it's the moment that finally fully removed any lingering hope I had of this being some kind of misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a conversation. I ran into a mutual friend, someone I'd known since college, at a coffee shop about a month after the breakup. She was warm to me, too warm in that particular careful way people are warm to someone they've been told is fragile. She asked how I was doing with everything, in a tone that made it clear she already had a version of events in her head. I told her plainly what had actually happened, the affair, the months of messages with Colton, the deliberate reputation management. She got quiet, and then she said something that I think about constantly, even now. "I mean, I hear you, but Derek's always been so easy to be around, and you have seemed kind of intense since the breakup, if I'm being honest." I wasn't intense before the breakup in her memory, because the breakup was recent enough that intense was the story that had already been planted for over a year. I left that coffee shop and sat in my car for almost 30 minutes before I could drive. Over the following 2 months, I watched my friend group quietly split, not in some dramatic, obvious way, but in the slow, unremarkable way these things actually happen. Some people stayed close to me. A larger number, honestly, drifted toward the version of events that required less discomfort, the version where the charming guy made a mistake and the girlfriend spiraled. I lost invitations to things. I lost the group chat entirely. I was quietly removed from it about 6 weeks after the breakup, something I only found out because someone accidentally referenced a plan I had no idea existed. I lost, in the most painful way, a friendship with a woman named Kayla I'd been close with for almost 5 years, who told me gently that she just didn't want to be in the middle of it, as if there were 2 equally valid sides to a story about a documented, months-long affair. I want to tell you about the lowest point, because I think it matters for the rest of this story to actually land. It was a Tuesday night, about 3 months after the breakup. I was at my apartment, alone, and I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was from a guy I'd matched with on a dating app, someone I'd exchanged a few messages with the week before, seemingly normal, seemingly promising. The text said, "Hey, so I don't think this is going to work out. A mutual friend mentioned some stuff about you, and honestly, I'd rather not get involved." I asked which mutual friend. He named someone from our old group. Derek's version of events had traveled far enough, quietly enough, that it was now affecting people I'd never even met. I sat on my bed that night, and for the first time since finding that hotel email, I actually let myself consider the possibility that maybe I should just quietly disappear from this whole social circle. Let him have it. Let him keep the friends, the narrative, the comfortable version of events where he got to be the reasonable one and I got to be the cautionary tale. I remember calling Priya that night, crying in a way I hadn't let myself cry since the discovery itself. And I remember what she said to me because it ended up being the thing that actually turned the story around. "You keep talking about this like the goal is to convince people right now," she said. What if the goal is just to become someone none of this sticks to anymore? Not because you argue your way out of it, because you build something so undeniable that his version of you just stops making sense. I didn't have a plan that night. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't plotting some elaborate comeback in that moment. I was just a woman on her bedroom floor, humiliated and furious, and completely unsure how to move forward. But something about what Priya said lodged itself somewhere in me and didn't let go. Because here's what I realized slowly over the following weeks. Derek's entire strategy depended on one specific thing. It depended on me staying small, staying reactive, staying exactly where he'd positioned me, an unstable ex-girlfriend, defined entirely by his version of a story that happened to her. The only way to actually dismantle that wasn't to argue with it. It was to become someone that story simply couldn't hold anymore. But what happened next, I never saw coming, because I had no idea sitting on that bedroom floor that it would take exactly 3 years, one terrifying career leap, a handful of allies I didn't expect, and one very specific industry award ceremony to finally, completely, publicly close this chapter on my own terms. I want to be upfront about something before I walk you through this next part. This wasn't a revenge plan in the traditional sense. There was no single moment where I sat down and said, here is my 6-step plan to destroy him. What actually happened was slower and honestly more deliberate than that, because the plan wasn't built around him at all. It was built around me. But I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how those 3 years of quiet, methodical rebuilding turned into the most satisfying kind of payoff, the kind he never saw coming, because he was never the target. He was just standing in the blast radius of me finally becoming who I was supposed to be. First, and I say this because I think it's the part people skip over in these stories, I got a therapist. Not as a plot device, as an actual, necessary, unglamorous first step. I want to be honest that the first several months of therapy weren't about Derek at all. They were about untangling why I'd let myself be talked out of trusting my own perception for over a year. My therapist, a woman named Dr. Okafor, said something in our 3rd session that I've never forgotten. The version of you he built wasn't random, she said. He needed a specific kind of person to make his story work, someone believable enough to have real relationships, but reactive enough that her reactions could be used against her. That's not a flaw in you, that's a target he selected. That reframing did something for me that no amount of arguing with mutual friends ever could have. It let me stop trying to defend the version of me he'd created and start actually rebuilding the version of me that existed before I ever met him. Next, I made a decision about 4 months after the breakup that I think surprised everyone who knew me at the time, including myself. I'd been working at the same marketing agency for almost 5 years, comfortable, underpaid, quietly good at my job, but never pushed to be anything more. I'd always had an idea, a real one, something I'd sketched out in notebooks for years, for a boutique consulting business specifically helping small, women-owned businesses with branding and marketing, something more personal and hands-on than the agency-style work I'd been doing. I'd never pursued it, partly because starting a business is genuinely terrifying, but if I'm honest with you, partly because some small part of me had absorbed Derek's narrative more than I wanted to admit. Some quiet, insidious voice that said, "You're too intense, too much, not stable enough to run something like that." Deciding to actually do it anyway became, without me fully realizing it in the moment, the first real act of reclaiming myself. I want to walk you through the early days of that business because they were genuinely hard, and I don't want to skip past that to get to the satisfying part because I think the hard part is actually what makes the satisfying part mean anything. I worked out of my apartment for the first 8 months. I took on small clients, a bakery, a woman starting a pet sitting business, a friend of a friend launching an Etsy shop for rates that barely covered my bills because I needed a portfolio more than I needed money in that specific season. I worked nights and weekends on top of my day job for almost a year before I finally had enough client income to go full time. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by half-finished brand decks, wondering if I was making a catastrophic mistake, wondering if the quiet voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like Derek was actually right about me. About a year after the breakup, I ran into Kayla, the friend who told me she didn't want to be in the middle of it, at a mutual acquaintance's engagement party. I almost didn't go, honestly, specifically because I knew Derek's crowd would likely be there. But something in me, some early version of the resolve that would carry me through everything after, decided I wasn't going to keep shrinking my own life around the possibility of running into him. Kayla approached me first, which I didn't expect. She looked uncomfortable in a way that told me something had shifted. "I need to tell you something, and I've needed to tell you for a while. I just didn't know how." She told me that about 6 months after our friend group had drifted, she'd started dating someone new, someone who, it turned out, had once dated Ashley, the woman Derek had cheated with. And through that connection, she'd heard, secondhand, but from a source she trusted completely, that Derek's affair with Ashley hadn't been a one-time thing that just happened. It had overlapped with at least one other relationship before me, using what she described as basically the same playbook. I felt sick when I heard it, Kayla told me, because I realized I'd believed the easier version of the story instead of the one you actually told me. I'm sorry. I should have believed you the first time. I want to be honest, I didn't gloat in that moment, even though some small part of me wanted to. I told her I appreciated her saying it, and I meant it, but I also told her something that, looking back, was probably the moment my whole approach to this crystallized. "I don't need you to fix what already happened," I said, "but if you ever get the chance to just tell people the truth instead of the comfortable version, I'd appreciate that going forward." Kayla became from that point on one of the people quietly correcting the record whenever Derek's name came up in conversations I wasn't part of. Not dramatically, just honestly whenever it was relevant. That mattered more than I expected it to. About 2.5 years after the breakup, this is the part where the actual arc of this story really takes shape. My business had grown past anything I'd let myself imagine in that first year. I'd hired my first employee, then a second. I'd landed a client, a regional boutique hotel chain rebranding for a younger demographic that became a genuine case study, the kind of project that gets you invited to speak on panels. I started getting invited to small industry events, then bigger ones. A regional business journal did a feature on me, 30 Under 30 in marketing and branding, with a photo, a write-up about the agency, a few quotes about resilience that I gave without going into any specifics, because I never once made this rebuild about him publicly. That was never the point. But privately, I knew exactly what that resilience had been built on top of. Priya sent me that article with a single text. "Do you understand what you're becoming?" I genuinely didn't, not fully, not yet. I was too deep in the day-to-day of running a business to step back and see the shape of what 3 years had actually built. About 4 months before the night I described at the very beginning of this story, I got an email invitation to a regional marketing industry awards gala, a genuinely prestigious event in our field, the kind where actual major brands and agencies show up, not just small local businesses. My agency had been nominated in the Emerging Agency of the Year category, based on that hotel rebrand. I was thrilled. And then, scrolling through the event's guest list on their website a few weeks later, something I did purely out of curiosity to see who else in the industry would be there, I saw a name I recognized immediately. Derek's new company, some kind of brand consulting startup he'd apparently started about a year into our breakup, was listed as one of the event's smaller sponsors. He was going to be there.
I want to be completely honest with you about my reaction in that moment because I think it's important. My first instinct wasn't triumphant, it was actually fear, a very specific, very old fear. The fear of being back in a room with him and his version of events, wondering if that quiet, careful energy from 3 years earlier would come rushing back the second I saw his face. I called Priya, genuinely considering pulling out of the nomination entirely. Absolutely not, she said, almost before I finished the sentence. You are not shrinking your own achievement because he might be in the room. Maya, do you understand that if you win this in front of him, having built this from absolutely nothing while he was busy telling people you were falling apart, that's not a coincidence you should run from. That's the ending this story's been building toward the entire time. I sat with that for a few days, and I made a decision that looking back was the real turning point of this entire arc, not out of spite, but out of something closer to clarity. I decided I wasn't going to prepare a single word about him. I wasn't going to plan some big confrontation, some dramatic call out, some moment where I stood up and listed his sins in front of an audience. I decided the most powerful thing I could possibly do was simply show up exactly as who I'd actually become and let that speak entirely for itself. Because here's what I understood. Finally, after 3 years, Derek's entire strategy had only ever worked on a version of me who was small enough, unsure enough, reactive enough for his story to stick to. The moment I stopped being that person, not performatively, not as some revenge tactic, but actually, structurally, in the reality of my life, his version of events would have nowhere left to attach itself. I didn't need to correct the record. I just needed to become someone the record no longer applied to. I did do one thing in preparation, though, and I want to be transparent about it because it matters for what happens later. I reached out to Priya and Kayla and asked if they'd both be at the event as my guests. Not for backup exactly, just because I genuinely wanted the people who'd actually stayed and the person who'd come back to the truth standing next to me if this night ended up mattering the way I suspected it might. They both said yes immediately. The week before the event, I did something I hadn't let myself do in 3 years. I went back through my old phone backups, the ones I'd kept quietly, almost as a form of self-protection more than anything else, and found the screenshots from that Colton conversation, the hotel email, the whole trail of evidence I discovered on his laptop 3 years earlier. I want to be clear. I never once, in 3 years, sent those to anyone, posted them anywhere, or used them to actively campaign against him. That was never who I wanted to be in this story. But I kept them, because some part of me, even back then, understood that the truth doesn't need to be weaponized to matter. It just needs to survive long enough to eventually meet the moment it's needed. I had no idea that week exactly how soon that moment was going to arrive. But what happened next, I never saw coming, because the awards gala didn't just turn out to be a night where I happened to run into my ex. It turned out to be the exact stage where 3 years of quiet, unglamorous rebuilding collided with his own unraveling in front of every single person whose belief in his version of the story had once cost me almost everything. The night of the gala, I got ready in a hotel room with Priya and Kayla, the three of us passing a curling iron back and forth, the kind of ordinary, warm chaos that felt almost unbelievable compared to where I'd been sitting on my bathroom floor 3 years earlier. Priya zipped up the back of my dress and looked at me in the mirror. "You know you don't have to do anything tonight, right? You don't owe this room a performance. Just exist in it." I remember laughing, nervous, and saying, "That's the plan. Just exist very, very well." We walked into the ballroom a little after 7. Round tables, maybe 30 of them, white linens, a stage at the front with a step and repeat banner for photos, a bar in the back corner already 3 deep with industry people networking before the ceremony started.
I saw Derek almost immediately. I'd like to tell you I felt nothing, but that wouldn't be honest. I felt a jolt, a very physical, very old recognition, the same jacket slightly too nice energy from that first party 6 years earlier, except now it read differently to me, less magnetic, more performative. He saw me too. I watched it happen across the room, the moment his eyes landed on me, then flicked down to the small nominee ribbon pinned near my name tag, then back up with an expression I can only describe as confused recalibration. He came over about 20 minutes later, drink in hand, that same easy smile from 6 years ago still fully intact. "Maya, wow, I didn't realize you'd be here." "Nominated for Emerging Agency of the Year," I said, keeping my voice completely level. "You?" "Small sponsor. It's been a growth year." Something in the way he said it told me it hadn't been, but I didn't push. He glanced at Priya, then at Kayla, and something flickered across his face. The recognition, I think, that these two women standing on either side of me, calm and present and clearly with me, were not the picture of an unstable, isolated ex-girlfriend he'd spent years describing. "You look really good," he said, "really put together. I'm glad." I remember thinking in that exact moment how strange it was to hear him say that with what sounded like genuine surprise, like the version of me he'd built for 3 years had actually convinced even him. I want to tell you about the small moment that more than anything else told me the balance of this story had already shifted, hours before the ceremony even started. A woman I didn't recognize approached our small circle a few minutes later, someone from Derek's table it turned out, a colleague at his firm. She introduced herself and then, glancing at my name tag, said, "Oh, you're Maya Reyes. I read the feature on your hotel rebrand last year. That project is incredible. I actually referenced it in a pitch deck last month." Derek stood there, holding his drink, while a colleague from his own company complimented my work, completely unaware of any history between us, simply because my work had traveled far enough on its own that it no longer needed his permission to exist. The ceremony started around 8. I sat with Priya and Kayla at a table near the front. My agency's nomination had earned us decent seating, while Derek's table sat further back, closer to the bar. I want to walk you through the awards portion slowly, because this is the moment 3 years of work either paid off or didn't, and I genuinely didn't know sitting there which way it would go. They went through several categories first: Best Campaign, Best Rebrand. I clapped for people I knew, tried to steady my breathing, felt Priya's hand find mine under the table at one point without either of us saying anything. Then the host said, "And now for Emerging Agency of the Year." They read the nominees, 3 other agencies, all solid, all names I recognized from the industry circuit, and then mine. Reyes Collective for their rebrand with Morrow Hotel Group. And the winner is Reyes Collective. I want to be honest with you. I don't remember standing up. I remember Priya's hand squeezing mine so hard it almost hurt, and Kayla already crying before I'd even made it to my feet, and the specific disorienting sensation of walking toward a stage while a room full of industry professionals applauded work I'd built quite literally out of the wreckage of the worst year of my life. I got to the podium, I looked out at the room, and I saw Derek's table, near the back, his expression somewhere between polite applause and something I can only describe as quiet, dawning realization. I hadn't prepared a speech about him. I want to reiterate that because it's important. I had a short, genuine speech about my team, about the client who took a chance on a brand new agency, about the mentors who'd believed in the work before anyone else did. But at the very end, almost without planning to, I said one more thing. I want to say one last thing because I think it matters, even if most of you won't know the context.
3 years ago, I was told by someone who knew me very well that I wasn't stable enough to be trusted with big things, that I was too intense, too reactive, too much of a liability to build something real. I want to say, for anyone in a similar spot tonight, that story was never actually about me. It was about someone who needed me to be smaller than I was, so his own choices would look better by comparison. And the most powerful thing I ever did wasn't arguing with that story, it was simply outgrowing the room it was written in. I didn't say his name, I didn't need to, but I watched from the stage the exact moment several people at his table turned, almost involuntarily, to look at him. I stepped down to applause that felt, honestly, bigger than the moment probably warranted for a regional industry award. But I think people in that room understood, even without full context, that they were witnessing something more than a business win. Here's the twist I genuinely didn't see coming, and I promise you this part is true because I couldn't have written it better myself. About 20 minutes later, during the cocktail hour after the ceremony, a man I didn't recognize approached me near the bar. He introduced himself as an investor who'd apparently been evaluating several small agencies and firms in the region, including, he mentioned almost in passing, Derek's company. "I have to be honest," he said, "I was actually surprised your speech didn't name names because I think half the room already put it together. His firm's been struggling to close funding for months. A couple of his own early investors have been asking around about, let's call it, pattern of behavior concerns. This isn't the first account I've heard of him building a narrative around someone to protect his own image." I hadn't known that. I want to be clear, I never went looking for information about Derek's business or his personal life over those 3 years. I deliberately stayed out of that world. Entirely. But apparently, the exact strategy he'd used on me, quietly managing perception, getting ahead of problems by controlling the narrative before anyone else could, had followed him into how he ran his company, and it was starting to catch up with him there, too. The final piece of this night happened as I was leaving, close to 11. I was in the lobby with Priya and Kayla waiting for our car, when Derek approached one more time, alone this time, his easy party smile completely gone. "That was a hell of a speech," he said, and I couldn't quite tell if it was meant as a compliment or an accusation. "It was true," I said, simply, calmly. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I genuinely didn't expect. "I probably owe you an apology. I'm not going to pretend I handled things well back then." I looked at him for a long moment. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think it's more interesting than a clean, dramatic confrontation would have been. I didn't feel rage. I didn't need the need to list every message, every lie, every friend I'd lost because of what he'd built. I felt something closer to distance, like watching someone from a life I used to live, from very far away. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "I hope your business works out. I really do." And I meant it mostly, not because I'd forgiven the specific things he'd done, but because I genuinely didn't need anything from him anymore. Not an apology, not an admission, not a public reckoning. I'd already gotten everything I needed, quietly, over 3 years, without him even being involved in the process. I walked out of that hotel lobby with an award in a paper bag, my 2 closest friends on either side of me, and the specific, unmistakable feeling of a chapter finally, completely closing. Not because I'd won an argument, but because I'd simply become someone the argument no longer had any power over. I've had some time now to sit with everything that happened, and I want to leave you with what I actually learned from this, because I think it matters more than the award itself. The first thing I learned is that a smear campaign, no matter how effective it feels in the moment, only works on a static target. It depends on you staying exactly where the story left you. The moment you actually grow, not performatively, not as some strategy, but really structurally change the shape of your life, the story stops fitting. It doesn't get disproven, it just becomes irrelevant. The second thing I learned is that the people who believe the easier, more comfortable version of a story aren't always bad people. Some of them, like Kayla, come back to the truth eventually, when it costs them less to do so. I don't think that excuses the years of silence, but I do. Holding on to rigid bitterness toward everyone who got it wrong the first time would have cost me more than it cost them. The third thing, and this one took me the longest to really believe, being called too much, too intense, too reactive by someone who benefits from you being smaller is not information about you. It's information about what they need you to believe about yourself, so their behavior looks reasonable by comparison. I spent almost a year of my life quietly shrinking around a description of myself that was never actually true. I don't do that anymore. If you're watching this and you're currently the person everyone's been gently warned about, the intense one, the dramatic one, the one people have started getting careful around for reasons you can't quite trace back to anything you actually did, I want you to hear this clearly. That story was written before you had a chance to argue with it, and arguing with it is usually a losing game. Build something instead. Quietly if you have to, slowly if that's what it takes. Let your actual life become the kind of evidence that doesn't need a rebuttal. I'm doing well now, genuinely. My agency has grown past anything I let myself imagine on that bathroom floor 3 years ago. I'm close with Priya and, surprisingly, with Kayla, too. We've talked honestly about those years, and I've made peace with the fact that people sometimes need time and distance to see clearly, even when I desperately needed them to see clearly in the moment. I haven't spoken to Derek since that lobby. I heard secondhand that his company folded about 6 months after that gala. I don't know if that's true, and honestly, I've noticed I don't feel much of anything when I hear updates about him at all anymore. That absence of feeling, more than any dramatic confrontation ever could have, is what actually tells me this is finished. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in my position, if you found out someone had spent months quietly building a narrative to protect themselves before you ever caught them, what would you have done differently? Would you have confronted him the night you found those messages? Would you have skipped the gala entirely or done exactly what I did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, the conversations in the comments section on these videos are half the reason I keep telling these stories. If this one hit you the way I hoped it did, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got another story coming next week that might hit even harder than this one, and I never run out of these, because it turns out, once people know you'll actually listen, they have a lot to tell you. Thanks for sticking with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.